about demographic transition. You guys just finished a virtual lab looking at how different countries' populations are changing differently due to economic, social, cultural factors. We're going to clarify some of those factors today and also discuss how to read a demographic transition graph. So today we're going to discuss the definition for demographic transition. We're going to learn about the golden rule of demographic transition, should help you apply this sort of concept quickly on AP tests and exams. And then we're going to learn how to read and break down a demographic transition chart. So just to make sure we're all on the same page about some key terms, for the lecture. The first one is industrialization. This is the process when a country's economy shifts from a primarily agricultural one to one that is focused on the manufacturing of goods. So you'll see that with the rise of factories, the rise of a lot of consumer goods and commerce, world trade, things like that. When we talk about economic development, we are referring to industrialization. So as a country becomes more developed, its economy is becoming more industrialized. So let's get to the definition for demographic transition. Demographic transition is the shift from high to lower birth and death rates in a country as development occurs and that country moves from a pre-industrial to an industrialized economic system. So what that means is that as your country becomes more industrialized, your birth and death rates are going to lower over time, but they're going to lower in stages. And these are the stages that we're going to talk about with demographic transition. There are 4 stages, and each stage corresponds to a country's stage of economic development that affects birth and death rates in specific ways. We're going to talk about those specific ways now. First, to sort of summarize how a demographic transition graph changes over time, as a country becomes more industrialized, first its death rate will decrease, then its birth rate will also decline to match. So again, first its death rate will go down, then its birth rate is going to go down to become roughly even with the death rate. So let's talk about a demographic transition graph. So on our x-axis here, we have time. On the y-axis, we have our growth rates. And we talked about in class, the growth rate is basically the rate at which our population grows. You can see that there are 2 lines to be considered on a demographic transition graph. There's our death rate line in red and our birth rate line in green. They may not always be colored this way, obviously, but on a demographic transition graph, you will always see 2 lines. I always remember that the birth rate line is the top line when they get separated from each other. So the birth rate line is here, the death rate line is here. So let's get into the stages of the demographic transition graph. The first stage is the pre-industrial stage. This is when birth and death rates are at their highest. So the population isn't changing much, but your birth rates and your death rates are both high. Again, this is a pre-industrial country, so often these countries are relying on subsistence farming and other means to run their economy. Often these countries are associated with a high infant mortality because there is a high prevalence of children in the workforce. This may seem like a random fact, but it is really important for the AP. This is always stressed with a stage 1 pre-industrial country. Almost no countries at this point are in the pre-industrial stage. You really have to try hard to find any examples. Most are starting the process of industrializing. So here's where it gets interesting. Next is our transitional stage. This is when a country is beginning to industrialize. And as I said back with our golden rule, first, our death rate is going to lower. The reason the death rate lowers first is because of increased food production and improved medical care. So less people are going to be dying. So your death rate is going down significantly, but then your birth rate right here is staying very high. So what's going to end up happening is that your population is going to increase significantly. And we saw that in our lab with a country like Nigeria. With Nigeria, when you simulated it to 2050, the population shot up very significantly. And Nigeria is in a transitional stage economy. So with Nigeria and other stage 2 countries, you'll see a big population increase because the death rate is going down. Next, we have the industrial stage. This country has industrialized, and then we have the birth rate lowering. So for stage 2, we had the death rate lowering. Now for stage 3, the birth rate is lowering here to match the decrease in the death rate. The reason that the birth rate is lowering is because of increased educational opportunities for women and access to birth control. So as you guys remember when we had the fertility rate conversation, educational opportunities for women means more women in the workforce, which means that many of them may have less time to take care of children in the home. And so that's why your birth rate is going to go down. And then access to birth control, you have less overall pregnancies, means that you have a lower birth rate. Your population is still increasing here, but it's not increasing as significantly, right? Because your birth rate is lowering to match your already low death rate. So because your birth rate is now lowering, now nearly as many babies are being made as people are dying. And so your population is still increasing, but it's starting to level off. You saw that in the lab with a country like India. It was still increasing in population, but it had started to level off. Last up is our post-industrial stage. These are countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil is in the post-industrial stage. This is when your birth rate has finally decreased to match your death rate. So birth rates and death rates are both low. That means that your population isn't changing too significantly. But you'll see here that the birth rate is actually going up and down over time. So that doesn't mean that your population is going to remain level the entire time. You saw with a country like the United States in our lab, the population was actually decreasing. And the reason for that is only because of a change in birth rates. It's not because of a change in death rates. So when a population like the US is decreasing in number, that just means that our birth rate is lower than our death rate. So in a spot right here, our birth rate is lower than our death rate, so our population will be decreasing. So, to clarify some language about these economic stages, when we talk about a stage 1 to stage 3 country, so pre-industrial to industrial, we are talking about developing countries. Again, we've talked a little bit in classes about how that's a little bit of a racialized term often, and it's not, doesn't fully capture the economic activity of a place. But when you hear the term developing, they're often talking about stage 1, 2, or 3 countries. Meanwhile, developed countries are in the stage 4 of their economy. So again, some key takeaways. First, demographic transition, again, is the shift from high to lower birth and death rates in a country as economic development occurs and that country moves from a pre-industrial to industrialized economy. Our stage 1 countries are those pre-industrial countries that have really high birth and death rates. And then our stage 4 countries are our post-industrial countries that have low birth and death rates. Our golden rule, again, as a country becomes more industrialized over time, first its death rate will decrease, then its birth rate will decline to match. And if you can remember that golden rule, you can remember which line is which on the graph and what stage of a country means in terms of the birth and the death rate. Now, let's do some guided practice. Thank you guys. Let's get back to class.